講演をいただきます。ジョンソン様はニューオーリンズやクライストチャーチなどの復興に携われて多くの被災地復興の実績をお持ちです。それではどうぞよろしくお願いします。Dr. Johnson, please.
Thank you very much. Konnichiwa. It's very much an honor to be here today amongst many other very important professionals and mentors, such as Professor Murasaki, who has taught me very much. As Rob said, I am going to speak about the practice. So while I have studied and received my doctorate degree, I really work mostly as a consultant to cities after disasters or in planning for disasters. So what I want to emphasize is that the practice of recovery isn't just the post-disaster planning process. And there will be 4 aspects of learning from Kobe as practice that I want to emphasize today. The post-disaster planning and implementation, the pre-planning for post-disaster recovery, so what we need to do to help cities get ready for disasters, how recovery can be a lens for disaster risk reduction or resilience planning by thinking beyond just the immediate impacts of a disaster and starting to think about the consequences to society over time. In disaster recovery, I have found that it is very helpful for communities to begin to really think deeply about disaster risk reduction in a more meaningful way. When they understand more than just what we call sometimes the death dollars and downtime, but also the long-term social and economic consequences. And the way we do that is by developing scenarios and also creating models of recovery. So in all 4 of these areas, the Kobe earthquake and the experience and the data collected by many people in this room, the long-term studies have been very, very important to improving practice all over the world. So I first want to share with you what I feel have been some of those key lessons from Kobe and key pieces of information that have influenced recovery practice. Rob showed this map. But I want to go back to this point in time. This was a map that was developed in the first weeks after the Kobe earthquake with the collaboration of university researchers, students, government officials, and many practitioners who came together to work across the Kansai region to come up with a comprehensive initial picture of the damage. And this map was very, very important because it did create this comprehensive picture. So as Rob said, information is an important currency of disaster recovery. This was that first very important yen in that information currency, so to speak. In helping government officials at the national level, at the city level, and residents begin to understand beyond just their one community what had happened to the region and how important this disaster was and how much and how challenging the recovery would be. And you have to remember, this was 1995. We didn't have Google Earth. No. We weren't able to just look on our cell phones and see something like this. So this was an incredibly valuable piece of information at that time. The second thing that I think is important to remember is, as Rob said, the sophistication and level of knowledge of city staff and leaders in Kobe. Mayor Sasayama was a city planner. He had helped rebuild Kobe after World War II. He understood the neighborhoods, the level of the years of buildings, how old they were, how well they had been rebuilt after World War II or not. Some neighborhoods were built very fast. He knew there were areas that had problems, that had landslide problems and flooding problems. And I had a chance to visit with him in 2009 when we were doing interviews for our book. And he told me that morning by 7 a.m., just within a few hours of the earthquake, he already had a sense, like that picture I just showed you. Because of his past knowledge, he knew what neighborhoods had probably been hit the hardest and which ones had not. And I think that understanding, not just of what you do to respond, where do we send the ambulances, where do we send the fire trucks, but to begin to think about the long-term rebuilding, the fact that you had a local leader who understood the whole city and knew the challenges of rebuilding was a very important lesson. And as Rob said, I think that's also this issue of capacity for recovery. When cities don't have that kind of expertise, it's going to be very challenging for them to begin to take on this monumental task of rebuilding. So with that came the confidence that central government had in local leadership, not just with Kobe City, but with Hyogo Prefecture, with the fact that there had been long-standing relationships in funding the urban development projects like Roko Island and Port Island and the Kansai Airport. This meant that central government agencies had good working relationships with their local counterparts. And that is a very important ingredient that you have to help build if that doesn't exist. If for the first time a local government leader is meeting his national counterpart after a disaster, then we have to really help them get to know each other and trust each other. And many times they just never will, because they just don't have that working relationship. And so out of that working relationship became something very important, which is what I call a shared vision of how the earthquake was going to be rebuilt. So this is a model of the rebuilding process that is really a model of how the money flowed into Kobe and made it through to different systems of the urban environment. And so the national government mainly funded infrastructure projects and funded recovery through mechanisms like redevelopment and land readjustment. And so while that was mostly what we call infrastructure reconstruction, it then worked its way in what we might call trickle-down methodology through the economy, through housing reconstruction, and ultimately to reconstructing lives and livelihoods. Now, there are some criticisms of this model, but I want to emphasize that this was a shared model, and so the shared nature of that is very important that I want to single out before we decide whether we want to criticize the model or not. Because I think it's very important that you have multiple levels of government working together with the same ideas. If you don't, then there's going to be lots of tension through the recovery process. As Rob talked about, to manage time compression, you cannot stop rebuilding, and you cannot control the actions of all the actors who need to act in recovery. So one way to deal with time compression is to take planning and recovery in steps. And Kobe did that with what we call now very simply the two-step planning process. But what that meant at the time was that Mayor Sasayama and Governor Kaihara took a very big risk and actually made a moratorium on rebuilding in some of the most heavily damaged areas while they took time to plan. But the other important part of that process is that for the non-heavily damaged areas, the areas we called the white zone at the time, those areas were told, go ahead, start recovery, you are free. You do not need to wait for us to come and do some sort of replanning. And that's really important to work with local governments after disasters to say, you cannot control and stop the planning process and the recovery process for everybody. You have to be selective on the areas where you're going to focus your attention. And so that is how we call it the two-step model, but it's the iterative approach. That you're going to take some time to set some general goals about recovery, but take more time to do more detailed planning in those areas where you need it. And that came through in the reconstruction plan for Kobe City and Hyogo Prefecture. And these plans were done at a high level within the first few months after the earthquake. So that was also something that is very difficult for cities to do, that kind of planning and get that far so quickly. As Rob mentioned, the importance of community participation, the fact that local government actually provided some funds, not a large amount, but some funding and support structure for planners to work with communities in that detailed planning, that second step, is very important, and is something that I try to emphasize in working with other places. To make sure that that kind of linkage between the people working in the neighborhoods and government is made. And I also want to acknowledge the importance of non-governmental organizations, the NPOs, not just in response, which we so often see, non-governmental organizations like the Red Cross and others working very quickly in disaster response, but in Kobe is really one of the first international experiences where we really documented the importance of non-governmental organizations to neighborhood recovery. And I just want to make a note of Kinmokase and the work that was done by Mrs. Amakawa, a dear friend who is in this room, in helping to plant flowers in the burned areas of Kobe as a sign of renewal very soon in the first summer after the earthquakes. That was a very early signal of revitalization and the building of social capital in those neighborhoods, the hope and the resilience to recover in those neighborhoods. So the value of that kind of work in recovery and reconstruction really became well documented and understood because of the Kobe earthquake. The other important thing that I think Hyogo Prefecture and Kobe City did, along with university researchers, was to actually document and monitor the recovery process. So there were global assessments that were done every 5 years, where outside experts were brought in to actually help the prefecture and the city evaluate their progress. And course corrections were made. And I think that's very important to actually be willing to look at the decisions you have made and to be critical of them and to ask others to be critical of them and to decide whether or not you need to make adjustments. So often I see governments get very committed to the decisions they made and they do not want to admit that maybe those decisions were not right. And I think that willingness to evaluate and monitor progress, Kobe really set an example for the world. And those lessons were shared globally. The US and Japan had a long history of government funding for researchers to exchange information, particularly engineering lessons. So Japanese researchers had come to America after the 1989 earthquake in San Francisco, after the 1994 California earthquake, to learn from our damage and our lessons. And likewise, we're very open to that kind of exchange after the Kobe earthquake as well. So these are just some reports from the earthquake, from those exchanges that had happened in 1995. There happened to be one of those exchanges scheduled to start the day of the Kobe earthquake. So there were 40 Americans in Osaka. Coincidentally, the US-Japan workshop was on urban earthquake hazard reduction was scheduled to start in Osaka the day of the Kobe earthquake. So instead, those researchers immediately went to support their colleagues here in Kobe in documenting the damage and understanding the impacts of the disaster. So some research that was very important to me that I've applied from the Kobe earthquake, first to call out Professor Murasaki's insights in managing recovery. What he pointed out was that you really couldn't just manage recovery based on time alone, that you had to think about 3 different dimensions almost of recovery. That there is a timeline dimension. We have to set goals. What is our goal? Kobe set goals in 2 years and 5 years of what they wanted to rebuild. But they also set those goals for different places. So I call those spatial strategies. What was the goal in one neighborhood was not necessarily, could be the same goal for another neighborhood. So recognizing that there are going to have to be different goals for different places, but also systems, so that you have to coordinate those system goals. The goal for water recovery needs to be matched with the goal for housing recovery and with the economic recovery. You cannot do those things, otherwise, as Rob said, things get out of sync. So the managing of time, space, and systems is a very important way to think about managing disaster recovery. And that came from observing the recovery process in Kobe. And one of the other outcomes of our study, our collaborative research, this is the report cover from that research, was that we talked about 5 factors that influence the time it takes to rebuild. And again, we're urban planners, so these are very much urban planning kinds of factors. But the first is how complex the property ownership patterns are. So in Kobe, we learned that it was much harder, and in California, we learned that it was much harder to repair condominiums and to undertake things like land readjustment processes where you had multiple property owners and you had to achieve consensus among those property owners. The amount of money and where it comes from, and the requirements, what we say the strings attached to the funding in English, that idea of the complexity of the funding and its availability also influences the time frame for recovery. The existence and pre-existence of, or the existence of plans ahead of the disaster, and understanding of the conditions. Like I said of Mayor Sasayama, having a good understanding of the city, but Kobe had just completed an update of its master plan, of its community plan, and that knowledge meant that the city had really just recently looked at existing conditions across the economy, across its infrastructure, across housing, so it had all of this recent data to work from. The institutional framework and the level of stakeholder involvement. Again, this notion of how complex the government structure is, and then the level of government intervention and the complexity of the regulations that are part of the recovery. So these really became what we call the sort of the levers that you can pull or relax to help accelerate recovery, or that can slow recovery down. So while all the lessons were not positive, what was important is they were all shared. And I think that is really something that we continue to value from the Kobe experience, was that exchange to make sure that from future disasters we had new standards or better policies and procedures in place. So I've worked in many places since the Kobe earthquake, and I wanted to talk about many of those disasters, but I picked one, which is the Hurricane Katrina case example one, because Rob was also going to talk about it, and we felt it would give you a complete story of how the lessons of Kobe were applied. My role in the Katrina recovery was to help lead the recovery planning process for the city of New Orleans. And so that is what I'm going to explain today. So this is an illustration actually of what I call a multi-level planning approach. So the two-step concept from Kobe was applied in Louisiana, where the state undertook planning, gave directions to every city. In this case, they were parishes, is what it's called, sort of like prefectures, of what they needed to do to also be consistent and complete their local recovery plans. And so there was a two-level approach from the state and the requirements of the city of New Orleans in its planning process, as well as information for individual homeowners and neighborhoods to undertake their planning. So a multi-level approach to planning. Within New Orleans, we also structured the planning process to be multiple levels. We didn't have the time luxury at this point in time when we were doing this planning process. We had to do these things at the same time. So we did the two steps simultaneously. We worked on a citywide framework while we simultaneously had had people working in neighborhoods and at what we called a district level to pull together multiple neighborhoods into a smaller set of plans that we could digest and make consistent with the citywide plan. So this is what we call the unified New Orleans plan structure, because we had citywide planning going on at the same time as we had district planning, and we had to keep it all very consistent. We also funded lots of planners to work in all of those neighborhoods. So we had teams of planners working at neighborhoods, working at districts, and working at the city. So there were hundreds of planners, and we had meetings with the community at all of those different levels. So we had what we called citywide congresses, where we tried to bring residents together from all over the country where they had been displaced. We had thousands of people participate in those meetings. And then we also had more like neighborhood meetings, like the Machisukuri level meetings, where people sat and looked at maps of their neighborhood and made decisions on a neighborhood basis. So that funding model from Kobe was something that we applied in the Unified New Orleans Plan. We also used Professor Murasaki's concept of recovery management in thinking about how to structure the recovery plan for the city. And so this is actually showing you how we divided the city in terms of policy by the two factors that we felt were going to be the most critical in terms of New Orleans recovery. One was how quickly would people come back to the city, and what was their future risk of flooding. At that particular time, people were very afraid of the next hurricane season and whether or not the levees were going to be repaired. And so we divided the policy structure for the city into three areas. Of those that had a high likelihood of recovery of their people and the less severe flooding risk, to the other extreme, which was the area that had the highest flooding risk and the lowest rate of return of people. And so within that then, for those policy areas, we looked at the policies we wanted to implement through time, across space, and for different systems. So the time, space, and system approach that Murasaki had laid out. And then we helped set up a city office of recovery management, somewhat like the restoration headquarters in Kobe. And also prioritize then the funding in these target areas. So actually going towards the spatial aspect of recovery investment. And the other notion of Kobe that came through in the neighborhood planning was very much the way neighbors talked about staying together as part of the land readjustment processes, where neighbors wanted to when they came back into their neighborhood, be next to their former neighbors. We also proposed a similar concept. While we didn't use land readjustment in New Orleans, we called it clustering. And the idea that since many neighborhoods it would take a long time for everyone to get back, we would try to encourage them to come back together and perhaps swap property rights with other people so that we could have people living closer together rather than one person on one street and another person on another street, but actually clustered together. And the city is still working on that today. In some neighborhoods that have been very slow for people to come back, the city is still intervening and actually buying out some properties here and helping people move over here. So as Rob talked about relocation, this is one place where that's still happening in an urban environment. So our story wasn't just about the work that we did, and I want to make some other acknowledgments as well. One was the work that actually very early on Rob brought the editor of the newspaper in New Orleans to Kobe. And we actually, Professor Kobayashi helped take Rob and the reporter Jed Horn up in a helicopter over Kobe, and this is the front page of the local newspaper that showed the pictures before and after of Shin Nagata in the fires right after the earthquake and then afterwards. But again, to sort of not just tell the lessons to professionals about how your city could be rebuilt, but also to share those lessons with people in New Orleans about the resilience of Kobe and how New Orleans also could rebuild. And there was also another interesting twist in this story. Sakato-san, who happens to be here today, was the Consul General from Japan in New Orleans at the time of the earthquake, or the hurricane, and we met with him very soon after the hurricane, a little less than a year, when Rob and I were in New Orleans. And he went on then to become the executive director of the Japan Foundation. And so while there were many national government-funded exchanges between researchers and government officials, the Japan Foundation also funded many very important exchanges between Kobe professionals, like planners in this case, in these photos. Planners from New Orleans came to learn from planners in Kobe, but also there was a jazz exchange, an MPO exchange, many different kinds of exchanges, and I think that that was very important to share those lessons beyond just government and researchers. So the second part of my work has been to try to distill all of this knowledge into planning guidance for cities before disasters strike. And so we worked on distilling those lessons into national planning guidance in the United States, into local planning guides. One guide that I'm working on right now is actually specifically for coastal communities in California to plan for a tsunami. And then also in pre-planning for local governments to be ready to run a recovery process. So I selected just one to illustrate that I'm also working a lot in New Zealand since the earthquakes in Christchurch. And we're working on a pre-disaster recovery plan for the city of Wellington right now. And Wellington, New Zealand looks very much like the San Francisco Bay Area and very much like Kobe, and has the same kind of earthquake faulting and risks and older buildings and all of those issues. So we're working very hard to help Wellington get ready for a major earthquake. And now, as I mentioned how you can use recovery as a lens for resilience planning, I just want to focus on the work that I've been doing in the San Francisco Bay Area in that regard. So we in San Francisco, this is what we call our earthquake forecast. So we have not had that big major earthquake. The last big earthquake that we had was in 1989. That was not as damaging as the big earthquake we had in 1906. And we're worried about the next big 1906-like earthquake. So this is just that forecast that we have in the next 30 years. These are all the faults in the San Francisco Bay Area that could trigger a major earthquake the size of the Kobe earthquake. And those are all the statistics from the different models that have been constructed of what those scenarios would look like. So deaths in the order of hundreds to thousands, many thousands of uninhabitable housing units, costs in the millions, many even hundreds of billions, and fires and infrastructure destruction, the same kinds of ingredients that were experienced in the Kobe earthquake. And so one of the projects that we've had is to bring together all of the utility operators in San Francisco to work together to develop a common understanding of how their infrastructure will be damaged and thus how their restoration will be dependent upon each other. So we call this lifelines interdependency. So we've used the restoration, those are restoration curves of different utility systems, water system, electric systems, telecommunications, to figure out which utility operator depends on which utility operator, and thus kind of like who is the most important utility for all of us to focus on, and thus what are the weakest links that everyone needs to be investing in. So we came up with, out of this study, a 5-year common agenda for infrastructure resiliency to share responsibility for upgrading our system so that all the utilities will benefit from those individual investments that one utility is making. Another big project that I'm involved with right now is called Haywire. And what that stands for is the idea of a major earthquake happening on one of our faults called the Hayward Fault, which runs through the East Bay, not San Francisco, but the other side of the bay, Berkeley and Oakland, and some of the oldest building stock in the San Francisco Bay Area, and a very dense urban environment with lots of wood frame structures, very much like Kobe. And the reason it's called Haywire is because we have not had a major earthquake in the high-tech age. So we do not know what our internet economy in Silicon Valley and the Bay Area, how it will respond to a major earthquake if many people are displaced, if the workers are displaced or the businesses are displaced. And that is what we wanted to study with Haywire. My work in that has very much been derived from the lessons from Kobe. I have been looking at what I call communities at risk. And so one of the first things I tried to do was construct a picture of the areas of concentrated damage. So in Kobe, that two-step process where they identified the areas where we would take more time to do more detailed planning, I'm trying to figure out in advance where those areas are likely to be. And the first step that I used was to actually bring together all these different damage calculations that lots of engineers do into one comprehensive picture, and to understand where you had concentrations, basically a percentage of the building area destroyed in a neighborhood. So we used the threshold based on the Northridge earthquake and Katrina of 20%. If an area has more than 20% of the building area completely destroyed, then it's an area at risk of recovery. And that is the number that we've seen in many disasters, sort of a tipping point of when it's very hard for a community to recover. So you don't have to have a community completely destroyed. You have to have a community partially but heavily destroyed to make it very challenging for that community to recover. So in this case, in those areas in the Bay Area from this earthquake, we would expect 1 million residential buildings damaged, 1.4 million housing units damaged, or a third of the region's housing stock having some degree of damage, and about 100,000 residential buildings, many of which are multifamily condominium buildings, would be completely destroyed or extensively damaged. The next thing we wanted to understand is who lives in those neighborhoods. Who are those people? And as Rob said, earthquakes and big disasters are not equitable. So we wanted to understand the social vulnerability of people in these neighborhoods. So we've actually looked at what the risk of population displacement is likely to be from this scenario, and the social composition. So how many older people, how many people with school age or young children, people with disabilities, people with lower incomes, people with very high, what we call housing cost burdens, because they pay a large amount of their salary for their housing costs. These are the things that we wanted to understand. So those bar graphs there are the social vulnerability of different neighborhoods. So in this case, we could expect 150 to 500,000 households displaced from this earthquake scenario, or possibly almost 1.5 million people. There are 8 million people in the Bay Area. So this is a huge amount of the population could be displaced. And over 400,000 people reside in those areas of concentrated damage that also have very high social vulnerability factors. So we're trying to zero in on those neighborhoods that have both concentrated damage and high social vulnerability. And then what we're doing is then beginning to identify a typology of areas needing substantial governmental involvement and replanning. So that second step of the Kobe process, where would we need to do replanning and why? So these maps just show where you have that overlay of concentrated damage and social vulnerability, and we've broken those down by areas that have ground failure, liquefaction damage, landslide damage, surface fault rupture damage, or just concentrated infrastructure and building damage due to fires and other aspects of the disaster. So that work is actually going to be published this year. And so, kind of in summary, what we believe is really the model and the modeling work now since the Kobe earthquake is big, to really think about all these systems together. You can't just think about disaster recovery is about rebuilding buildings and infrastructure. You do have to think about the social systems, the economic systems, the governance systems, and also the natural environment. So this was just a way that I try to show people that often as engineers we look at this this pyramid from the bottom up, whereas planners, we tend to think about the natural environment and the built environment first, but we have to always remember that people and sociologists and social capital views of this pyramid look at it from the top down. But it's our job in modeling a disaster and in working on disaster recovery planning to think of the whole, to maybe look at the pyramid sideways, to recognize that all these pieces are part of a holistic community resilience and recovery model. And the last point I want to make about Kobe that I think is so important has been the commemoration. The fact that not only have you repeatedly year on year come together to look at remember the people whose lives were lost, but that you also celebrate the resilience of the community year on year with the luminaria. And that is something that so often I see communities not actually do. They want to move past the disaster, but people need to grieve. And I think it's very important. And I always point to what Kobe has done and how it continues to remember and to celebrate. And I think that combination is very important and is a very important legacy of the Kobe earthquake. ありがとうございます。